I'd like to welcome you to this Tune In and Tune Up Drought and Wellbeing webinar. My name's Andrew Coughlin and I head up the Emergency Services Program within Australian Red Cross. Thank you for joining us today in what is the fourth of our five-part webinar series looking at drought and wellbeing. I'd like to start firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting. In my case here in Melbourne, we are on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation. So I'd just like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And similarly, the First Nations people in whatever part of Australia you find yourselves today. And just acknowledging the impacts of events like drought and bushfires more recently, and of course COVID as well on those First Nations people, how sometimes those impacts can be quite disproportionate to the rest of the community. It's important to acknowledge that it's been particularly tough in recent times with things like fires and COVID, and now to add insult to injury, in some parts of the country we're seeing large amounts of rain over the last few days, which are having an impact, probably distracting some people from the notion that drought and the aftermath or ongoing nature of the impacts of drought are still very much affecting the communities in which many of you live and work. So we're very aware of that and wanted to keep the seminar or the webinar series going throughout. So as part of the Drought program, we are facilitating these 5 webinars, bringing together a diversity of speakers to support us to better support our own communities through work, your own individual situation, and also supporting your loved ones through these tough times. The recordings of the first 3 webinars can be found on the Red Cross website, so please have a look at those if you weren't able to join us previously. Just type in Red Cross Drought Program and you should be able to find that on Google or wherever else you access websites. They look at prolonged stress and maintaining wellbeing, the drought cycle, adaptation and resilience, and lastly, wellbeing after the rains, which is particularly prevalent in some places at the moment. Before we get into our speakers this morning, I'd just like to let you know that we'll be recording this session and it'll be made available again on our webpage, so you can share it with others or go back to it if there are things that you missed out on that you'd like to have another listen to or another look at. We'll have time for questions at the end of all the presentations, but please, as we go along, if you could ask questions throughout via the chat box. We'll have someone monitoring that and merging some of the similar questions, and we'll then use that as the first port of call for questions at the end of the presentations. For any unanswered questions, we're also compiling a list and we'll write up and circulate those at the end of the series. So we'll endeavour to do what we can to address all the questions throughout. As with all technology that we're all becoming very familiar with over the last little while, please bear with us if there are any momentary glitches. We'll do what we can to fix them on the fly, but let's keep fingers crossed that we don't have any. Today, we're focusing on family wellbeing in the face of drought and ongoing stress, exploring what the research tells us about the experiences in adult relationships, families and children in drought, as well as some practical tips on how to support those around you and your communities. To do this, we've got 3 speakers with us today. Firstly, Dr. Margaret Alston, a professor at the School of Humanities and Social Science at Newcastle University. Margaret has a focus on rurality and gender and has published widely in the field of gender and disasters, social work and rural social issues. So some really strong background there with Margaret. Stephanie Schmidt is a clinical psychologist and farmer in South Australia. Is passionate about developing a resilient rural Australia and providing easy to understand strategies to improve health and wellbeing. Steph was recently awarded the South Australian 2020 Agrifutures Rural Women's Award, a fantastic achievement. Congratulations, Steph. Very excited for you. And our third speaker today will be Dr. Margaret Nixon. Margaret's currently a senior trauma specialist at the ANU and has over 20 years experience in education and research in the field of children's mental health, wellbeing and trauma. and has been heavily involved in the network that looks at those issues over a long period of time. So it'll be interesting also to hear from Margaret when her time comes around. So to start, it's over to Margaret Alston first, and let's hear about what some of the research is telling us. Thank you and welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody, and thanks for attending this webinar. I have 18 minutes, so I'm going to talk quite quickly. So what we have here is a slide of rainfall in the last 3 years, showing that for many parts of Australia, it's either severe deficiency or lowest on record. Overlaid on that this year, we've also had fires in a lot of those areas that are similar. So the depth of disaster issues in many parts of Eastern Australia and Central Australia and the whole continent are extreme. So what's happening in rural and remote communities and on farms in drought areas in particular? I'm going to give you an overview of statistics, and the two speakers following me will go very much into personal relationships, etc. So broad brush things, around 7 million Australians live in rural and remote areas. It's a gendered issue because more women live in cities than in remote areas. 46% of population is female in more remote areas. Overall population in rural and remote areas is older because young people tend to leave for work and education. In terms of rural and remote health, the ABS suggests that rural and remote Australians have poorer health and welfare, but greater life satisfaction. I think that's really important to note. There are higher injury rates in rural and remote areas, and when you think of the types of farming issues, farming occupations and injury-prone issues, you'll understand that statistic. However, rural and remote areas have less access to medical facilities, so that can be an issue. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare notes that life expectancy is higher in the cities, and again that relates back to health issues. So there's poorer health overall, and this because of risk factors such as smoking, drinking, physical inactivity, obesity, etc. Access to GPs is similar, but there are longer waiting times in rural communities. But access to other rural and remote health services are fewer and less available. For example, dentists, physiotherapists, etc. COVID has added an extra dimension to this, but we have much lower numbers in rural areas, and that relates to the advantages relating to isolation. The graphic there just tells you that if Australia's rural and remote population was a city, it would be the largest city in Australia. So the issue around lower population rates, etc., shouldn't mask the fact that we have a significant proportion of our population live in rural and remote areas. We did some work on education access during drought some years ago, about 10 years ago. And what we found in that particular study, and it was done in drought areas at the time, is that regional, rural and remote residents have less access to education. HSC completions in the city are obviously higher, and as you go down the scale, you will see that in fact they're lower the more remote. Bachelor degrees and above are higher in the city, and as you go further out, they're lower. Now, I'm raising those not necessarily to say, to demonstrate problems in relation to it's access issues. There are access issues for rural and remote students that we need to be cognizant of and actually work to be addressing. Statistics show that regional, rural, remote students are less likely to complete high school, and to things like taking up their uni offer, they're more likely to defer, etc. Now, when we did our study, we found that children whose farms and families were impacted by drought may in fact tell their parents they're not interested in university to ease the financial stress on their parents. I think this is a really big issue, and children told us that that's what they were doing. We did work in schools across many areas of rural and remote areas, and this was an issue that really troubled me, that the way children were trying to help out by doing things like this. At the time, we found in some areas that children were going to school hungry, and some schools were instituting breakfast clubs. One issue that really also was important was around School of the Air, which was becoming very difficult for parents to support because both partners were working on farms. And I think this is an issue in relation to School of the Air type education, particularly as some families delaying boarding school, so children are kept back longer from schools. Community changes in relation to all of these types of issues indicate a decline in farm worker roles and hired labour, and particularly in the more remote areas, and that has led to some farm families and farm worker families leaving communities, and therefore there's a consequent loss of services and population. So that leads to loss of neighbours, more empty farmhouses, fewer people to do community work and to maintain community organisations and buildings like community halls. Loss of school numbers means reduction in teacher numbers and reduction in subject offerings. Closure of some small schools, long bus rides for some kids, loss of school bus routes and children's friends, and a lot of children made those sort of comments to us at the time. However, in areas of high amenity, of course, there's now an exodus of people looking to regional communities as a sort of a tree change. So we shouldn't lose sight of those. Also, there are countervailing growth patterns happening in some areas. Service infrastructure, for example, we did some work in rural and remote communities looking at birthing services and access to birthing services, because a lot of small hospitals lost those sorts of services. And we called our report of that research, luckily we had a torch, and that indicates the growing number of women who are giving birth on the sides of roads, for example. So there are real issues around that sort of closure of services for medically sound reasons in a lot of cases, but we need to balance that with what's also happening. So service infrastructure also includes sometimes poor roads, which aren't managed necessarily frequently, loss of businesses. The issue that really strikes me is around IT services, because if we're going to do things like telehealth and School of the Air, etc., we need to have adequate IT services and mobile phone coverage. We don't have that in a lot of areas of Australia. So in my view, that's an economic and safety issue, and that impacts on farm business efficiency and on things like women's safety in isolated circumstances. Let's move on from those types of statistics. What rural communities are renowned for are vibrant, supportive communities, neighbours helping neighbours, informal support services, very rich networks, local community gatherings of all of the people in communities. I put in a quote there, but this support may soon be a thing of the past because of the crisis facing some rural communities. driven in part by declining population, etc. So we need to really look at the types of issues that are affecting communities in drought-affected areas. I'm just going to quickly refer to a study we did in the Murray-Darling Basin in areas where there was reduced water for irrigation, and it just sort of gives you an idea of what's happening in a lot of communities. So we did focus groups, interviews and questionnaire in 3 regions of northern Victoria, and we focused on communities that were defined by the MDBA as especially vulnerable. They had smaller populations, high dependency on agriculture and high reliance on irrigation. And what we found in those communities is smaller farms are reliant on off-farm income earned most often by women. The larger farms, everybody's being drawn into the work, including women and older generation and children, etc. There are some health issues as older people stay doing quite physical work. This has led to uncertainty, stress and declining commodity prices and water markets. What we also noted very clearly was the rearrangement of work roles on small farms, and we were picking up erosion of resilience over this long period of change. So one of the quiet revolutions is that more than 50% of Australian farms are now dependent on off-farm income. And you would imagine that in drought areas that people are seeking alternative income. What we've also found, and this is government-sponsored research, is 80% of this is done by women, and depending on the level of remoteness, between 42 and 46% of Australian farm women work off-farm, contributing about half of real farm income. So it's really hard for me to see some of the writing here, but anyway, I'll just play it by ear. So in that study, we found that both men and women reported that they had increased their on-farm work, and 15% of women noted that they would need to increase their off-farm work over the next 12 months, and 46% that noted that they would need to increase over the next 5 years. But 93% noted that there weren't those sort of jobs that would give them that sort of support in their local communities. And that meant that a lot of families that we've spoken to over the years were practicing involuntary separation, where one or other would go. I mean, could be the men to the mines, it could be women to regional centres. So those sorts of issues are quite relevant when we're talking about rural communities and how people are coping with the changes. Okay, now I'm a bit stuck. It's not going to move forward. I wonder if you could have a look at that, Andrew. Oh, there we go. So this, in the circumstances, the vulnerability of people is being tested with constant changes in policy, high workloads, loss of family and friends, lack of trust in water governance. Oops. Okay, that's doing very odd things.
I think Alex will be working on that for us behind the scenes, Margaret. So if you're able to keep going without the slides for a minute or two, would be great.
I can. I just have to talk it through. Okay, I've got it open here and I'm just going to work through it on my own. Presumably you can hear and see me. Okay, so there's another project I've been working on as well called the Invisible Farmer Project, and that's being done in conjunction with the Victorian Museum, and we were looking at collecting stories of women and historical records. There's also now a visible farmers study, which is being done elsewhere. I'm sorry, I'm just keeping an eye to make sure that I can see everybody. Okay, but what I also wanted to raise in this context is the issue, the silent issues that are in the background, and others will speak about the sorts of issues that I raise here. We're seeing an increase in domestic violence exacerbated by drought and in fire areas and pandemic areas. We're seeing an increase in stress and anxiety, and we're seeing fear about the future, certainly in relation to COVID, and worry about children and their futures, and young people finding they're wanting to know what may well happen in the future. What we do know is domestic violence is the leading preventable contributor to death, and women in rural and remote areas, violence can be quite a terrifying experience. We know that violence against women increases during and after disasters. That looks a bit promising. Thank you. Now, it's not letting me move on, unfortunately. Perhaps we can address that issue as well. Thank you. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So we know that violence against women increases during and after the disaster, increases according to bill cycles. And women are reluctant to report this for a number of reasons around shame, financial pressure, feeling a bit like that's a betrayal to report things. Can you move to the next slide? I'm sorry, I don't have control. A study in South Australia with rural women seeking help noted that women experienced a range of different types of violence and a range of abusive behaviours. And these experiences often led to social isolation. It's very complex seeking help, and that's highly dependent on support networks. So friends and family should be tuned into these sorts of issues. And women can be generally coping on their own for quite long periods of time because they understand the drought situation, they're worried about their family, they don't want to open up to public scrutiny the sorts of things that may well be happening. They want to maintain their dignity and their pride, and this can lead to isolation. So people should be on the lookout for the sorts of withdrawal from communities and that sort of thing that may be happening. So disasters like drought magnify reluctance to support, and it's really important for family and friendship circles to be attuned to that, because usually the first approach will be made at that level, and if that's rejected or not listened to, then that can have quite serious consequences and women won't report again. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So in the wake of disasters right across the world, this is not unique to us. These sorts of issues are happening, and so services dealing with mental health and domestic violence routinely report increases after disasters, and often in relationships where there hasn't been no previous evidence of violence. And this can happen, we've picked this up in all sorts of disaster areas in Australia and elsewhere. The stress of the type of disaster that you're living through is really has huge implications. There's also, of course, the issues of mental health issues for men who don't want to raise issues around that. And that generally relates to things when they're not able to control the environment or to live up to their own and others' expectations of them. That sense of stoicism comes into the way men respond to this, and that can be really damaging to men's health. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So my last slide are just about the sorts of issues that over the years people have offered to me, and these are the work pressures on and off farms, the lack of childcare, lack of validation, involuntary separation, IT problems, emotional stress, experiences of violence, coping and resilience factors, the fact that usually women monitor the emotional health of others in their family and ignore their own health, hiding stress, gendered expectations on both men and women, and compliance with dominant discourse. Okay, I think my 18 minutes is well and truly up. Apologies for the issues that we had with the slides, but handing over to Steph. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and yeah, appreciate your efforts with the technical glitch along the way, but it certainly didn't take anything away from your presentation, which was really interesting and painted a really powerful picture for us. So again, a reminder to people to please record any questions in the chat function, and we'll come back to those at the end of our three presenters. So over now to Steph, who is both a clinical psychologist and farmer, but also significantly a wife and mother. So Steph, look forward to hearing from you.
Excellent, thank you, Andrew. Was it flicked over to my video? Oh, anyway, I can see from here. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone for linking in today. I'm very excited to actually be speaking today because as a clinical psychologist, but as Andrew said, also a farmer, a wife and a mum, I think this webinar series is just really vital at the moment. We live in the eastern agricultural areas of South Australia. For anyone who knows South Australia, we're on the wrong side of Goyder's line. So for me today, I'm coming both from my professional knowledge as a psychologist, but also from my personal experience as well, and knowledge of the work it actually takes to continue having somewhat healthy relationships during times of prolonged stress. Even just last night, I was reminded of putting in place the strategies that I'll be talking about when my husband came home from a few days at our other farm. We'd just sold some more sheep, which went for a price much lower than what we thought. And we're now facing our 4th year of drought and 3rd year of failed crops. We've had about 4 mils of rain in the last 8 weeks. So I know just how much work it can take to look after ourselves and our relationships. So what I hope to share today are some tips for everyone that can help understand the challenges, but also start to make some changes as well. So while I'll be focusing mainly on our adult intimate partner relationships, lots of these ideas are applicable across to all of our relationships. So whether it's kind of your adult parent-child or even within farming family businesses where you've got a group of adult relationships, and even then through to our friendships and the community relationships that we have as well. And so really during times of stress, it's important that we focus on what we can actually control. And at the end of the day, the one thing that we can control is basically what we do. We don't have a whole lot of control over our thoughts and our feelings. We have even less control over the thoughts and feelings and actions of other people. And I think we all know that we've got very limited control over the weather. So going forwards, right. So I guess we all know that meeting our partner, getting married, forming a family business, it's not the end of the story. It takes a lot of work to have these relationships in our lives. The idea of a perfect partner or a perfect relationship that's kind of sold to us, and the idea of a perfect Hollywood ending is probably one of the greatest myths around, I think. So today I'll be using some of the information from a book that I particularly love based on a lot of research into relationships, which is by Dr. Russ Harris, called Act with Love. And I'd highly recommend it to anyone. I've got a few resources at the end of my presentation. But the first step that we need to do is to watch out for what drains our relationship. And so this is identifying the 5 basic processes which are guaranteed to really drain the vitality and life from any relationships. And then once we're aware of these, we can start to practice switching off our autopilot reactions and then taking steps to remedy this. So first off, we've got the D for disconnection. And at the core, our relationships really are about connections. So whether it's our relationship within a marriage or within our family businesses or within our whole communities, we need that connection to have healthy relationships. And that connection and interest and might be easy at the start of a relationship, but as life goes on, we can start to become more disconnected. And I think even more so in the context of farming and drought, and as Margaret was just talking about with people working more off farm, it's not only the emotional disconnection, which might be through that ongoing stress or exhaustion, having too many things on your plate, but also a physical disconnection that takes place as well when members of the family kind of take on additional workloads. On a personal perspective, for us, we have another farm 2.5 hours away, and thankfully it actually has rained there this year. But what that's meant is my husband's kind of spent 80% of his time down there over the last 6 months. And so that disconnection within our family and managing that for ourselves and our kids means that we have to be even more aware and kind of conscious in creating the connections, both when he's away, but then when he's back as well. Because I guess, unfortunately, disconnection really can be a vicious cycle. When one partner disconnects, the other can disconnect as well. So then we've got reactivity. When we're on autopilot, we tend to react fairly well automatically to a situation rather than taking time to stop and assess and then choose how we want to respond. And in times of stress, kind of the more reactive we are as a partner, the more likely we are to kind of get hooked into the thoughts and stories our mind tells us rather than being able to see the bigger picture. And so when we kind of react on autopilot, we tend to do things that kind of suck the life out of our relationships rather than kind of building connections in them. Then we've got A for avoidance. So as humans, we really don't like discomfort or pain. We don't like feeling pain, and usually we'll do anything possible to avoid that pain. And this works pretty well on a physical level. So we learn quite quickly not to touch a hot stove. But on an emotional level, the more we try and avoid emotional pain or uncomfortable feelings, it often ends up creating more problems. So we have lots of strategies that we put in place to avoid uncomfortable feelings. So it might be distracting ourselves, kind of numbing out on social media, taking our mind off things, or even throwing ourselves harder into our work. Putting stuff into our bodies, so food, chocolate, or harder substances like alcohol and other drugs, or even kind of retreating into our comfort zone, so kind of withdrawing, refusing to talk, shutting down. And all of these strategies work pretty well in the short term at making us feel better. But in the long term, they can have a really detrimental effect on our well-being, our quality of life, and impact our relationships as well. And then the I is for when we get stuck inside of our mind. We all have these minds that like to talk a lot. We have this kind of constant running commentary going on about everything we do and about everything that everyone else does around us. And while some of this can be helpful or useful, there's an awful lot of chatter in our minds that's often pretty unhelpful. And in terms of our relationships, our mind can kind of be this judgmental, critical, problem-solving machine, looking out for what's gone wrong in the past, what might go wrong in the future, looking out for anything to complain about in what our partner has or hasn't done. I know for me, I've probably had a lot more arguments inside my own mind with my husband than I've actually had with him in person. Some of these have happened when he's not even in the same room or in the same house as me. And so my mind gets hooked on something that has happened in the past or might happen, and then replays this stuff over and over. And when we get stuck inside these stories, we then become more disconnected, we become more reactive, we become more avoidant. All of these things start to play together. And we kind of lose touch with what's actually happening in the present moment. And as we get caught into all of these cycles, we tend to then start neglecting our values. And our values really are around what's most important to us as a person, how in an ideal world we would like to be, as a wife, as a farmer, as a person, as a husband, as a father. And so if we kind of take a whole lot of people in relationships and ask them the qualities that they would like to have in their relationships, the things that tend to come up would be things like kind of loving, caring, affectionate, or supportive. What usually doesn't come up are things like aggressive, sulky, irritable, withdrawn, nagging. But when we get caught in this drain, it's that second list of words that we're much more likely, and those behaviours that we're much more likely to do. So when we get stuck in that drain and that automatic reaction, we're much more likely to kind of neglect what's actually important to us in our relationships. So what's the antidote to this? How can we kind of choose to do things differently? So this is where we can choose to act with love. And this is another acronym, but it's recognizing that love isn't just a feeling. It's not, I guess, just a behavior. It's a behavior. It's choices of actions that we can make every day. And so even when we do muck up, even when we do get caught in that drain, we can choose to kind of step in and take actions towards what's most important to us. And so the first step is to let go. And that's really about letting go of all of those stories that get stuck inside of our mind. And kind of recognizing that these thoughts and stories that our mind tells us are actually just that, just kind of thoughts, stories that our mind makes up about the world. And in fact, it doesn't actually matter if they're true or false. It's more what happens when we get caught in them and how helpful they might be to us in this moment right now. So it's kind of about trying to hold them a little bit more lightly rather than kind of clenching them with both fists. Then we can start to open up, and opening up, I guess, is the opposite of avoiding our painful feelings. It's really around making space for that discomfort, noticing that you can be bigger than that painful feeling itself. You don't have to get rid of it or avoid it. And I think starting to open up and make space for our painful feelings is particularly important in our relationships, because it's sometimes not even the feelings within our relationships that can have that impact. It might be all the situations that are going on outside of our relationship. So it might be that frustration and disappointment and uncertainty of drought. And then if we get caught in kind of trying to get rid of or avoiding those feelings, they kind of flow into our relationships and build into that drain as well. But opening up kind of gives us this way of making space for those feelings. So then we can start to actually act on our values. And that's being able to take this time to identify what's most important to us and how we actually really want to be in our relationships. So taking some time to actually just clarify what our values are and how we want to be. It might be thinking back to when you first met your partner, or when you first developed your business plan, when you first had your children. What were those things that you kind of really thought about that you wanted to be as a person? There's kind of 3 good starting values to explore, which are around connection, caring, and contribution. So we can start to think about just small steps we can take, things we can do to kind of emphasize these values in our relationship. And so then engaging is being really truly present. I guess it's the opposite of that disconnection and avoidance in our relationships. And so choosing to be present in those interactions that we have. And so then one last thing I wanted to speak about is this idea of the magic ratio, which is developed by Dr. John and Julie Gottman, which recognises that our brains have this natural negative bias, particularly during times of stress. And so we actually, to create healthy relationships, we need to have about 5 positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction. And so if we actually pause and reflect on the interactions we have in our relationships, whether it's with our partner, our children, or our other friends and community members, taking that time to notice, okay, what's my ratio at the moment and what are some steps I can take? What are some small kind of rituals of connection that I can put in there to flip that over and make sure that I'm having more positive interactions? So it might be as simple as sending a little text to your partner through the day, or making sure you give your kids a cuddle even if you're tired at the end of the day. So building up that interaction. Okay. And so I just wanted to spend a bit of time talking about what happens when arguments do actually occur, because arguments and those kind of ruptures within our relationships are 100% normal. They're natural and expected, and particularly during times of stress, they're really much more likely to occur as well. But what the research kind of shows is it's not the arguments themselves that impact our relationships, it's what we do after the arguments occur. And so what's actually more important is making the repairs after that rupture's happened. So the same as if you've had a blowout on your machinery, making that repair so you can keep on going is more important than kind of trying to make sure, I guess we need to make sure that the blowouts don't happen in the first place, but repairing so you can keep going forwards. And so it's being able to take those steps to kind of step in, build some connection, whether it's just a hug, even if you're still not feeling like it, or a phone call of connection. And just as importantly is for the other partner to then respond and kind of take on that repair attempt as well. So the person who has been hurt to be able to kind of make space for that. So one tip I like to remember is that we need to be able to kind of sow the seeds of connection in our relationships. And so this is remembering to kind of slow down, observe what's going on, and then choose to do what matters. And this can be done kind of in the moment of having an argument, or if you're feeling kind of that stress build up and kind of realize that the choices you're making aren't in line with what's actually most important to you. Having that reminder just to kind of slow down, take a few breaths, it might be kind of remove yourself from the situation for a few minutes, and then start to observe and just notice, okay, well, what's happening for me right now? What's those stories that my mind is telling me that I'm getting hooked up in? And even kind of coming in with a bit of curiosity, observing what might be happening for my partner, and then actually choosing to do what matters most to you. And that's reflecting back and going into your values. So even again, as I said last night, my husband got back and he was exhausted. I'm exhausted as I'm 39 weeks pregnant and have 2 small kids. And we were trying to sit and have a chat, and it just, the connection wasn't happening, and I was getting really frustrated at him. And then I kind of slowed down, was able to kind of observe what was going on, because this was all present in my mind in preparing the presentation. Noticed my own reactions that were coming up, so noticing my own feelings of tiredness. We were also working through some farm business stuff, so noticing that discomfort and that kind of worry and anxiety that comes up, and then think about what might be going on for him. And it was realizing that frustration and disappointment that he had when the lambs that we'd sold hadn't gone for anywhere near the amount. And when he comes back from our other farm, it's really a reality hit of coming back to brown paddocks here at home. And so once I could kind of slow down and notice that, I could kind of tune into what's most important to me, which is really around connection and support. So checking in with him, and even just kind of that connection of having a cuddle. So before I finish off, I guess this is some information that I have used for developing today's seminar, but also that I'd highly recommend. So as I said, Russ Harris has booked Act with Love, and he's got some additional resources there. And then also the Gottman Institute on Facebook, they have some really handy little tips for kind of looking after your relationships. And also really recommend the 5 love languages, which is an idea of working out what your love language is, what your partner's love language is, and a handy app to go with that as well. And then Smiling Mind app, which is really great for kind of building in that present moment as well. Thank you very much. I think that's
brilliant.
my time.
Thank you, Steph. And with all that going on and 39 weeks pregnant, I think we ought to add magician to your resume as well as everything else. Some fantastic insights there, really very much appreciated. Again, a reminder to people, please capture any questions in the chat box off to the side, and we'll come to those after the third of our speakers, which is the second of our Margarets. Margaret Nixon, over to you to talk with us a little about some of the impacts on kids, please.
Hi, thanks for the invitation to share with you today. I'm coming to you from lockdown Melbourne, and I have to say from the outset, it's just been amazing to hear from the other speakers. My experience of drought goes as far as being born in Broken Hill, so I will not try and say that I have a lived experience of drought. However, we have been working at the ANU and Emerging Minds in the area of research from children and about children and families, and the impact that these stressful events can have on them. The other thing I'd like to, before I sort of go into how we can best support our kids, is to acknowledge the knowledge and experience that you bring for all of those that are listening and who do and have experienced drought and are experiencing drought. As I'm speaking today and I'm talking about, you could try this, or, watch out for this, or talking about strategies, I really urge you to take those in and to consider those in light of the families, the children and the community that you're in. So take what I have, and hopefully it will also bring to mind other strategies that you have used or other support things that you know work. It's really important, as we started at the beginning today, to recognise the incredible complexity that the whole country is experiencing. And we know that with the drought, and then, as Margaret said, the overlay between then fires, and then some people getting some rain but not enough rain, and then we have COVID, and then the impact of trade. And this has been a complex year, and it's a complex year for adults, and we've heard how adults have responded to this. It's also a complex year for kids, and we'll hopefully be able to give you some tips as we go along. I've got a short amount of time, and there's always a lot to say. So what I will say from the beginning is that everything I'm talking about today is on freely available resources that I have sent through to the Red Cross, and I understand they're on the Red Cross website. So don't worry if you're missing tips or if you don't write everything down. They're all there freely available for you to download. We've heard today, and it's kind of a privilege to be the final speaker, because I think that the crafting of this website has really come from that community setting, then into the family setting and the importance of those intimate relationships, and now into our kids. And our kids are impacted by those intimate relationships and by those community events. Those relationships and those communities are the things that provide the really vital connections for our children. And as they're impacted by these ongoing stressful events, as the community is impacted in ways that we've heard about, and as our relationships, our intimate relationships, our family dynamics are impacted on, then we can see that this then impacts on children. And that's who I really want to focus on today. I keep forgetting, sorry, I've forgotten to click the slides. So let me go a little bit further from the intimate relationship to the family unit, and how prolonged stressful events like drought can impact that family unit, and then how they impact children. What research tells us is that the family unit is an incredibly important part. Those family relationships, strong, stable, connected, attuned relationships, are vital for children for their development and for their capacity to grow and thrive. They're also vital in being able to provide that support when challenges come. Children really fall back on and look to those relationships in order to support them during stressful times. Now, what the research would show is that, you know, for drought, sometimes these can put an incredible strain on relationships, as we've heard from the previous speaker, but also we know that it can be a time where families can draw together. And we've heard from young people quite recently about, yes, there are so many challenges, but some of them also did say that it was a chance for them to feel that their family unit had actually become a stronger unit. They felt more connected, more involved. So it's not, I do not want you to hear that we've got these layers of stress and it's all bad news. It's not at all. What we know is that parents really want to protect our kids. We want to, you know, all those stresses that we've just heard about that, you know, farm families are dealing with, they want to protect that for their kids. They don't want their kids generally to be taking on these anxieties, these worries. But kids pick up, they know something's going on. And if we as parents don't do some talking and communicating with them, then kids start to fill in the blanks with their wonderfully strong imagination. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about the importance of holding conversations and how we can best discuss these quite tricky subjects with kids. Also, we know that children want to protect their families. And we heard from Margaret with the first speaker how children sometimes don't want to say to their parents that, you know, I want to go to university or I'd like to go away to school, because they don't want to add to the burden of what is happening already at home. We can see they can start to take on adult responsibilities. And this is more than just helping around the place or doing their fair share or contributing to family. This is where we start to see kids really wanting to protect parents. And so they start taking on the emotion and the anxiety that the parents are taking on. They take that on with the hope that they can protect their own parents from this. Now, oh good. So what can we look for in our children? How can we look for if they're really struggling at these times? One thing that we really need to stress is that all of us in stressful times will be impacted, but our responses may be different. And it's the same with children. A child's response is just as strong, it has just as much sentiment, is just as important as an adult's response to stressful situations. However, it might be different. And then between children, we know that it's different. And we also know that if you've got multiple children or working with multiple children, you will know that each of them may respond differently. Their concerns are different. There are two things that, and a bit like adults, looking for changes in behaviour and looking for changes in moods. These are two areas that we can start to see that the kids may be communicating with us. We often say that behaviour is a form of communication. It's letting us know. And as adults, we can have tantrums when really we want to actually be saying something, but we're not quite at that stage yet. Maybe we haven't worked it out ourselves. And children and young people are very similar. We can see some behaviours that are around keeping things inside, and we can see behaviours that are around externalising. We can see these externalising behaviours. It might be that you see a child or a young person becoming more moody. You might see them acting out more. You might see a shorter fuse, smaller things, and then they're flying off the handle. For very young children, you might see changes, outward behaviours in things such as developmental milestones. For example, they may have been not wetting the bed for a long time, and then suddenly they start to wet the bed. You might see that children who normally with a kiss and a story would lights off to bed, that wouldn't see them again till the morning. But now you're finding, oh, they're coming out. Oh, my tummy's sore. Oh, I need this. Can you leave the light on? These changes in behaviour from children are very normal. They are feeling stressed or a bit overwhelmed, and this is their way of being able to tell you that. The internal behaviours you might see are children becoming more withdrawn, a child spending more time in their room, not wanting to go out and see people. You might see children who are not wanting to leave your side. So they are more anxious about going to school, anxious about going away from you. So these sorts of changes also are ones that can give you a bit of an indication that your child just might be struggling that little bit. You might find that you hear from schools that there could be some trouble in concentrating. Another thing that you might see is that you might be saying, I've told you 1,000 times, go and get your shoes and socks on and clean your teeth. And a routine that normally your children would be often completing, let's say, 7 out of 10 times on a good morning, but that you're sort of finding you're really having to prompt them. Well, where did you put your shoe? Oh, have you looked at the back door? These sort of normal problem-solving routines that we go through every day, you're seeing this is getting a little bit more difficult for your kids. Other changes might happen not in behaviour, but much more in mood. And you might see things like them becoming more overwhelmed, more teary, more with a sense that you get that sense that they're feeling burdened, that they're feeling quite heavy. These are also changes. These are also communications that might be saying that, they really are struggling here. Now, I want to say at this point that while these changes are quite normal within a stress response, if you see that these are ongoing, and if they start to intensify, get worse, or start to really interrupt with your child's normal way of normal development, then that's a really good marker for you to contact a GP who can then put you in touch with some support. And I would really urge people to do that, whether it's via telehealth or whether it's going to visit a GP. And that support might come in the form of some tip sheets, or it might come into the form of helping you get in touch with a mental health professional or an external professional that could provide you with more specific support. And just to say, there is some information on the website around stages of children from 0 to 12. So that will give you a bit of a hand on being able to look at the ages that suit the children that you work with. As I said, we have lots of resources, and just to finish off, I'm going to go through this series that comes from this handout here called Supporting Children During Drought. And there are 7 tips that are given in this handout. And with I can also say that Emerging Minds has just released a series of podcasts that have been created by families who live on farms in rural and remote area, and also by experts who are also adding in their advice along the way. And these podcasts cover each of these 7 topics that I'm going to talk about, and also the other resources on the website will also flesh out this information a bit more. So the first one is trying to look at things through your child's eyes. And this was a little bit, we just heard about trying to look at things through your partner's eyes. Well, just taking that time to be able to look at things through your child's eyes. Look at the things that have changed for them. Realising that the things that, being open to the fact that some of the things that have changed for them or that are important, the changes that have happened, may not be as strong on your radar. and just sort of trying to think about what are the differences now that we're trying to sort of work through this prolonged stress of drought, and what are the changes? What might these kids be thinking about or worrying about? What might they be thinking about when they're listening to you talking about your farm, you know, what's going on at the farm, and sales and trade, and looking at rain forecasts? What might they be thinking? We can imagine as parents what they might be thinking, but by asking kids directly, that's a great way to be able to look at these and to be able to get that real understanding of what's going on. And I just have to say, I think I've missed the first and most important point, which is looking after yourself. So can I just go back one where it says, try looking after yourself, which is point 1. I'm sorry, I missed that one. And which is very remiss, because this is that notion that we have the little byline of caring for the carers. Looking after our relationships is so important. Looking after our own mental health as parents and as professionals is really important, and just trying to carve out that way of doing it. And the podcast gives some really great examples of how families have been able to do this, to really look after themselves. So I just go back, we just before that looked at looking at things through your child's eyes. And as I said, looking at being able to understand and have conversations with your children. And at this point, I'd really like to point out that for some of our children heading into this prolonged stressful situation, they might come with their own vulnerabilities. And this might be that they have just started a new school or moved to a new house before they entered this phase. They may have bigger challenges such as physical, mental or developmental disabilities. And all of these need to be taken into consideration as you're supporting the child. When we're having our conversations, how do we do that? For me, I've got a number of kids and I always found being in the car was a really good place to have a conversation, because, you know, you don't have to look directly at the child or the young person, and you can just throw the question up and you keep driving and you've sort of got them in there. And even if there's no answer, asking, hey guys, how you going? You know, what are the things that are on your mind? And just leaving it there, letting them know that you are interested and you want to hear. Now, other families do it a bit differently. Other families say, listen, Sunday night, we're all going to get together. And this is going to be a chance for us all to talk about what's coming up, what's been great, what are we worried about, what are we concerned about, what are we looking forward to. So again, don't be too concerned if the kids don't, you know, sort of all open up with deep and meaningfuls, but it's a way of you letting them know, hey, I'm interested. And you know, the rest of the family are interested. And if it's not now, let's make a time. Come and talk to me some other time. And a little... Margaret,
sorry to butt in. We're just getting a little bit tight for time. If you could wrap it up in the next minute or so would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Just an important thing is that if kids come to you, then just to be aware that if it's a time where you're extremely busy because it's always in the middle of preparing dinner or something else, just say to them, hey, that's a really important point. Can I come and talk to you as I'm putting you to bed tonight? The other ones that are really important, that is, we've talked about looking at children's behaviour, supporting social connections. And again, listening to the podcast is a great way of getting ideas of how to keep those connections going. And remembering that even though some of the community events such as football and things like that may be impacted, whether it's through COVID or whether it's through things being closed down, then still trying to keep those connections with wider family is really important. And focusing on a positive future. The notion that this will end, or that yes, this is cyclical, this is what happens, but here are some of the things that we can look forward to. In finishing, 3 really important things. Share with your kids, sharing with your kids, and being connected with your kids is really important. Having patience, finding that extra sense of energy to be able to have that conversation with your kids, that extra hug at bedtime, and just to be able to remember that if your kids are struggling and you are concerned about them, don't sit there on your own being concerned. Link in with support networks of family. Make sure you ring your GP or get in contact with your GP so that if kids need some help, they can help you at different stages of where you might need that assistance. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Margaret. And apologies for winding you up there. I feel like you were just really getting into the swing of it, but some really insightful information. Thank you. And thanks to all three of our presenters. I think we've had some quite different but very complementary presentations, each of which painted a little bit of a picture of some of the challenges that are being faced, and clearly there are many of those. But I think also importantly provided some tips and ideas on what you can be doing, whether it be with your children or in your relationship or for yourself. So we will capture all of those things, particularly those tip sheets and other sources of information that both Margaret's and Stephanie provided, and we'll capture those on the website. So if people didn't get a chance to jot those down, you'll be able to access those. Just a short opportunity now for some questions, and I'd like to throw to Mel Morgan, one of our emergencies team within Red Cross. Mel, what have you picked up from the chat box?
Thank you, Andrew. The first question, I think I've got a question for each of you. So the first question I've got is for Dr. Margaret Alston. We had someone ask, could you tell us a bit about how much access women have in the remote farm areas in terms of phone and communication services? So what research tells us about access?
A very good question. Yeah, there are online services that people can access, you know, including the fairly obvious one, Lifeline. There are also domestic violence type services and other accessible services. Many people choose to want to talk face to face, and they might travel for that to a regional centre or a nearby town. I think the big issue is around maintaining anonymity, and a lot of people wish, you know, not to reveal what's going on, certainly in the beginning of problems. So yes, there are services available. It's about whether people feel able to access those is a critical issue, and we need to provide support to people to do so.
Fantastic. Thanks, Margaret. The next question was for you, Steph, and it was just around how do we actually look at engaging people who may be withdrawn or not used to talking about their mental health, or may be a little bit closed when it comes to talking about wellbeing issues? How do you start a conversation with someone who's in that headspace?
Yeah, sure. I think to start with, coming alongside somebody, even what Margaret was speaking about of having a conversation with kids in the car, that same idea of doing it while you're doing an activity or something together, of going for a walk together, I guess, depending on what the relationship is, whether it's your partner or whether it's a professional, like if you're a support worker or something. Yeah, trying to just open up and really about active listening. So putting the questions out there, but then giving them that space and knowing that they might not necessarily have all the answers of what's going on as well at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we've got another question for you, Margaret Nixon. We had someone ask how they can support their child when they themselves are experiencing anxiety, stress, or depression. So what are the expectations around behaviour from parents in those kind of situations?
Yeah, great question, and extremely broad, because it would depend on the age of your child and also the severity of your symptoms, and what sort of level of support you are getting. So I would start with making sure, caring for the carer, number one. So making sure that you are getting support for that is appropriate for the level of anxiety or depression that you are experiencing. And again, linking back to Steph's work around partners being on board with this and seeing this as a partnership issue, that particularly if you're talking with your children and young people. Explaining things like anxiety and depression to children and young people is an age-appropriate thing. So putting it in terms that the child can understand. Sometimes I feel a little bit sad, but I am getting some help from it, and daddy or mummy or whichever parent it is helping me with this, and these are some of the things that I'm doing. Letting the child know this is not about their fault. They do not make me as a parent feel sad or anxious or depressed. They're names that we give to things when we have lots of worries. So I suppose, again, having a factual, honest conversation, but not overburdening a child with information that they don't need, and letting them know, as an adult, I'm looking after this and my health with the support of my partner, through the help of my GP or the wider family. And so that's the sort of thing, caring for the carer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Margaret. I'm conscious of time. We don't really have a lot of time for more questions, but if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat for the last couple of minutes. And what we'll do is we'll send out answers to any questions we weren't able to address today. So we'll send out a PDF at the end of all of the webinar series. So I'll throw back to you, Andrew. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mel. And just a reminder to people that from a Red Cross point of view, the program that we're pleased to be able to provide, we don't see ourselves as experts on drought in any way, shape or form, but we like to try and bring together people with that expertise with the communities that are being impacted. So that's the small contribution we feel like we can make, and we'll continue to do that for the length of the program. Can I make a quick thanks to our three presenters again, to Margaret, to Steph and to Margaret. I think some fascinating insights, and as I said earlier, a really useful blend of not only what some of the challenges being faced by different groups and different people are, but also some potential, if not solutions, ways of dealing with things. I think really, really good stuff to have there. A reminder that all that information, the recordings and so forth, will be available via our website. So I would recommend you have a look there if you have the opportunity or want to retrace any of the stuff that's been talked about today. You'll be sent a follow-up email as well, and we'd appreciate if you wouldn't mind doing a quick survey just to give us a little bit of feedback on the value of these sessions and how we might continue to improve them. And we would certainly look forward to you joining us at the 5th and final of our webinar series, which is on the 12th of August, and it's entitled Preparing for Tough Times. So I think in one of the earlier webinars, we actually talked about the cycle of being involved with drought or living in drought-prone communities, that it's a constant preparing, responding, recovering cycle that continues on almost in an ongoing manner. So we will swing back to the preparing for tough times in that next session on the 12th of August. So again, thanks to our presenters. Those insights, I think, not only helpful in the drought context, but really applicable to a lot of things that we're all seeing in the community at the moment across bushfires and COVID and various other challenges that are going on in what's an incredibly unpredictable year. And just in closing, to wish Steph well with the 1 week to go until the arrival of a new baby under the scene. So always some positive and exciting news there. We wish you well, Steph. So thank you again to all our presenters. Thanks to those who helped put the podcast, or not podcast, the webinar together. And we hope you'll be able to join us in the next one on the 12th of August. Thank you very much, everyone.